Could I have the scraps?" The voice at Denver Cole's door belonged to a woman so thin the lantern light seemed to pass through her. She had crossed an ocean to reach a husband who died before she arrived, and now she stood in the road dust of a failing Wyoming ranch with nothing left to ask for but the leftovers of the stranger's meal. The rancher who opened that door had gone hungry himself years before, and he did the thing no one in that country did. He pushed his whole plate across the table, and what grew from that one plate is the story of how a woman, trained in the old ways of Japan, and a rancher one bad season from ruin, turned a dying spread into the place the whole territory rode to for a meal, stay until the end to see how a single act of kindness became the wall that held back a man who thought he owned the county. The drought had taken 3 of Denver Cole's best cattle in the week before the woman arrived, and the ones, still standing, stood in the creek bed with their ribs showing like the keys of a broken piano. The ranch had been sliding for 2 seasons, the south pasture gone to dust, the hay barn half empty, and the note his dead partner Jed had left behind sitting in Denver's chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. He hadn't told anyone about the note or about most of it. A man on the edge of losing everything doesn't narrate it. He just keeps working until the work runs out. The lamp on the table was kerosene, and the flame jumped and steadied, throwing amber light across a plate of roasted chicken, sourdough biscuits, and a scoop of beans cooked soft with salt pork. It was more than he had eaten in a week, and more than most men within 50 miles had eaten in a week. Denver had put it together because a man with a debt he can't pay still sits down to a meal on the night he expects to lose the place, and he eats like it matters. He had just lifted the fork when the knock came. The knock came twice, quiet, the kind a person makes when they expect to be turned away. He set the fork down and crossed the room. The door stuck in its frame the way it did when the wood swelled, and he had to put his shoulder into it, and the night air came in cold and smelled of dust and the creek going dry. A woman stood on the plank step. She was small-framed, thin in a way that spoke of hunger rather than delicacy, and her jet-black hair was pinned in her traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head. The lantern behind Denver threw amber light across high cheekbones, fair skin, and dark almond eyes that looked straight into his without dropping. The kimono she wore was faded at the seams, and over it she had a dust-coated trail coat 2 sizes too large for her, with the sleeve frayed where the cuff had been turned back. She held nothing in her hands. "Could I have the scraps?" she said. He had expected a hand asking for work, a man with a warrant, or one of the bank's clerks come to count his losses early. He hadn't expected this. The voice was low and steady and careful with the English, and the words came out the way a person speaks when they have practiced the sentence the whole way up the road, because they might only get to say it once. She didn't beg, and she didn't explain. She stood on the step and waited for whatever came next, and the waiting had the quality of someone who had already accepted the worst possible answer. Denver knew that look. He had worn it himself, years ago, the winter he came west with nothing, and walked 3 days through snow to reach a line shack where a stranger fed him without asking why. He remembered the weight of that plate pushed across a table and the way his hands had shook when he picked up the fork, and he had promised himself, in the way a hungry man promises himself things he can't keep, that he would do the same for someone else if he ever had a table of his own. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "Sit down." She hesitated, and the hesitation wasn't fear. It was the pause of a person checking whether an offer was real before they let themselves believe it, and then she stepped inside, and he shut the door against the cold. He didn't make her a smaller plate, and he didn't scrape the edges and call it scraps. He picked up the plate he had been about to eat from the roasted chicken and the beans and the sourdough biscuits still warm from the skillet, and he set it in front of her at the table, poured coffee into the second cup, and sat down across from her without eating and without watching her eat, because watching a hungry person eat is a kind of theft. The first bite she took was small, The way a person eats when they're afraid the food will be taken back. The second bite wasn't. She ate the way someone eats who has been hungry long enough that the body has stopped asking permission, and the silence between bites was the silence of a woman trying not to weep in front of a stranger. She didn't weep, but she finished the plate, drank the coffee, and set the cup down with both hands, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. "Thank you," she said 2 words, in the same careful English. He nodded. He hadn't expected gratitude, and he hadn't expected anything, and he had only expected the knock to be a clerk or a hand or a warrant, and instead it was a woman with a kimono and a knot of black hair and eyes that looked at him as if she recognized something in him she hadn't expected to find. The kerosene flame jumped and steadied. Outside, the wind moved across the empty pasture, and the creek bed cracked in the cold. "What's your name?" he said. "Mickey," she said. "I'm Denver." She nodded once, the way a person nods when they're storing a name somewhere safe. He didn't ask where she had come from, or why she was alone, or how a woman in a kimono came to be standing in the road dust of a failing Wyoming ranch at the end of a dry October. He had been the stranger at the door once, and the man who fed him hadn't asked either. "There's a bed in the back room," he said. "It's not much. You're welcome to it tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at the plate, checking whether the offer was real. "Tomorrow I will earn it," she said. It wasn't a question. It was genuinely spoken, like she actually expected him to hold her to it. "All right," he said. He banked the fire and turned the lamp down. For the first time in the months since Jed's note had arrived, Denver Cole slept without lying awake counting the cattle he had left. She was already up when he came out of his room, and she had the kitchen stove lit and the coffee on. The light through the window was gray, the kind of dawn that comes in October on a ranch with no future, and she moved through it like someone who had been moving through kitchens since before she could speak. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, and she turned once, caught his eye, and went back to what she was doing without a word. He had expected her to leave in the night, or to leave at first light, or to sit at the table and wait for him to feed her again. She had done none of those things. She had taken the kitchen, the way a hand takes a horse, quietly, and with the same assumption that the work would get done whether anyone was watching or not. He opened the pantry to show her what there was and what there was, explained why a ranch fails. A sack of pinto beans near empty, a slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth, a scoop of flour, sourdough starter in a crock with a cloth over the top, 2 withered potatoes, a single onion gone soft at the neck, dried apples in a jar, and coffee. That was the store. That was the whole store. She looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient. He watched her face decide something without her saying it was little or saying anything at all. She pulled the salt pork out, set the beans to soak in the warm water on the back of the stove, and cut the onion in halves with a knife she found in the drawer and tested on her thumb before she used it. He went out to do the morning chores. When he came back an hour later with the one remaining hand, a young man named Tucker, who had stayed on for room and beans when the wages ran out, the kitchen smelled like nothing that had come out of it in months. The salt pork had been rendered down to a white fat in the iron skillet. The onion had gone in. The beans had gone in with the dried apple, cut fine for the sweet, and the sourdough had been pulled into flat cakes and laid on the top of the stove to bake. The coffee was on, and it was the same coffee, but it smelled different because she had cracked a piece of dried apple into the pot. Tucker stopped in the doorway. The boy had been eating Denver's cooking for a year, and Denver's cooking was what a man learns to do when he has to, which is to say it was fuel and not food. Tucker's eyes went from the stove to Mishi to Denver, and he didn't say a word. They sat. She set the plates down. There were no scraps on either plate, and there was no extra, and there was nothing wasted. She had taken what there was and made it go as far as it could go. And the place it went was somewhere neither of them had eaten before. Denver took the first bite and stopped chewing. The beans were sweet and savory at the same time, and the salt pork had given up everything it had to the pot, and the onion had melted into the broth until there was no onion left, only the depth of it. The sourdough cake was crisp on the bottom and soft inside, and it soaked up the bean broth the way bread is supposed to soak up something worth eating. He had grown up on beans and salt pork and sourdough, and he had eaten them 10,000 times, and he had never eaten them like this. Tucker ate with his head down. The boy cleaned his plate, stared at the empty plate, and stared at the stove. "That's the best meal I've had in a year," Tucker said, and he said it the way a man says something when he doesn't know he's going to say it until it's already out. Michi didn't smile, but something moved in her face, a small shift at the corner of her mouth, and she picked up the plates and took them to the basin. Denver watched her back, the straight line of her, the way the kimono moved under the dust coat, and he understood something he hadn't understood the night before. She hadn't been asking for scraps because she had nothing to give. She had been asking for scraps because she had nothing left to carry what she had to give. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Can you do it again tomorrow?" It wasn't a question. She heard it the way it was meant, and she nodded once without turning around. He noticed the box the second morning, sitting on the small shelf by the back-room bed, and he didn't ask about it until the third evening when she set it on the kitchen table of her own accord. She didn't open it right away. She set it down in front of him and put her hand on the lid, and the gesture had the weight of a person showing a stranger the one thing they have left that matters. The box was lacquered, dark red, worn smooth at the corners by years of handling. It was the size of a hymnal, and the lacquer had a crack running across the lid that had been filled with gold powder, so the crack had become a vein of light running through the wood. He had never seen anything like it, and he said so. "My grandmother repaired it," she said, and the English was slow, but the word grandmother was clear. She opened the lid. Inside, fitted into grooves in the wood, were packets of dried herbs folded in paper, each one marked with brush strokes he couldn't read. Beside them lay a silk roll the length of his hand, and when she unrolled it, fine needles caught the lamplight, so fine they seemed to throw no shadow at all. Under the needles was a folded sheet of paper covered in Japanese script, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of cloth, a carved wooden spoon with a bowl worn thin from use. He didn't touch anything. He looked at the needles, and he looked at her. She watched him look. "Kyoto," she said, and pointed to the box, and pointed to herself, and pointed back through the years. "My grandmother, before I was born." He understood that the box was older than she was, and that the things inside it were older than the box, and that everything in the room that mattered to her fit inside it. He understood also that she had shown it to him for a reason, and that the reason wasn't pride. She told the rest in pieces, in the careful English she had, and he put the pieces together the way a man puts together a story he's being told in a language that's not the teller's own. She had come from San Francisco. A man in the territory had paid a matchmaker to send for her, and she had crossed the ocean to marry him. And when she arrived, the man was already sick. He died inside a month. His family, who had never wanted a Japanese wife in the house, took the things he had left her and put her out on the road with the box and the clothes she wore. For weeks she had been walking east, eating what she could find, until the road ran out of farms and into ranches, and she had come to Denver's door because there was a light in the window, and she had run out of places that weren't doorsteps. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the lamp had burned down, and the kitchen was warmer than it had been, and the box still sat open between them. "Where are the papers?" he said, and he didn't make it a question because he already knew the answer. "The family," she said, and she made a small gesture with her hand that meant they had taken those too. He sat with that for a long moment. He had been hungry, and he had been broke, and he had been alone, but he had never been a woman in a country that didn't want her, holding a box of needles and a paper she couldn't show to anyone in authority. The cost of what had been done to her was larger than he could say, so he didn't try to say it. "Can you sleep with that box in the kitchen?" He said. "There's a shelf above the stove. It'll stay warm there." It was a small thing to offer. She heard the size of it, and she heard the rest of it, and she put the box on the shelf above the stove with her own hands. For a week she cooked 3 meals a day out of the same pantry, and the pantry didn't run empty because she used nothing that wasn't already there, and she used all of it. Denver watched the beans go further than beans had ever gone on the ranch, and he watched the sourdough starter double back on itself and become bread instead of a chore, and he stopped asking what she was doing and started eating it. Tucker told a friend at the general store in town. He didn't mean to make anything of it. He was a boy who had eaten a good meal and wanted someone to know, and the someone he told had a brother who drove cattle through the territory, and the brother rode out the next week with 2 hands and a hunger that had been on him for 3 days. Mitchie fed them. She didn't ask whether they could pay. They left coin on the table anyway, the way men leave coin when they have eaten something they didn't expect to eat on the frontier, and Tucker brought the coin to Denver and put it in his hand without a word. Denver tried to give it back. Mitchie took it out of his hand and put it in a jar on the shelf above the stove next to the lacquered box, and the look she gave him ended the argument. The store owner came the week after that, with his wife in a buttboard loaded with flour and salt pork and coffee and dried apples, and he traded the goods for 2 meals and a place to sit. The buttboard was a working wagon built for hauling, and the store owner had loaded it the way a man loads a wagon when he plans to come back for more. Denver learned the English words for things she didn't have words for, and she learned the English words for beans, for more, for sit down, for thank you, and once, laughing at something Tucker said, for the first time since she had arrived, he heard her laugh. It was a short, low sound, and it surprised her as much as it surprised him, and she covered her mouth with the back of her hand and went back to the stove. The cattle driver who came that second week was a man named Zane, who had been moving beeves up from Texas for 15 years. He had eaten at every stop between the Red River and the Yellowstone. He ate 3 helpings, paid for 4, and rode south, telling every camp he passed that there was a kitchen on a failing ranch in Wyoming where a Japanese woman was making beans taste like something a man would ride a day out of his way for. The men he told came, and the men they told came after, and by the end of the second week, Denver had started keeping account in the ranch book, the same ledger that held the cattle and the hay, because the kitchen had become a thing worth counting. The jar on the shelf filled, and the pantry stopped being empty. The ranch was still broke, and the note was still due, and the cattle were still dying in the creek bed, but the kitchen was alive, and for the first time in a long time the ranch was bringing in coin that hadn't come from selling off a cow. Success on the frontier always draws the attention of someone who wants to take it, and the someone who wanted to take this one rode a horse that cost more than Denver's born. The man who rode in on the 3rd Thursday of November was named Harlan Cawley, and he owned the spread upstream, the water rights to the creek, and most of the debt in the county. He was a big man in a clean coat, and he rode a horse that cost more than Denver's barn, and he came up the drive at a walk with the certainty of a man who already owns the place he's riding toward. Denver saw him from the corral, and his stomach went cold. He had been pretending the note didn't exist for a month, and the pretending ended when Harlan swung down off the horse and walked across the yard with a folded paper in his hand. Mitchie was in the kitchen. She had the back door open for the air, and she heard the horse and the boots on the porch, and she came to the door of the kitchen and stood there with a cloth in her hands and watched. Harlan didn't look at her. He turned to Denver, and he held out the paper, and the paper was a note signed by Jed for the price of the south pasture and the water that ran through it. Harlan had bought the note from the bank in Cheyenne for the price of the paper and the trouble of carrying it, and the note was due in 30 days, and if the note wasn't paid, Harlan took the pasture and the water and the ranch on top of it, because a ranch without water in Wyoming is just dirt. Denver took the paper and read it. He had known it was out there, the way a man knows a winter is coming, but he hadn't known Harlan held it, and he hadn't known the 30 days. He looked up from the paper, and Harlan was watching him with the patient look of a man who has done this 4 times before and will do it 4 times after. "You can sell me the place now and walk away clean," Harlan said. "Or you can write out the 30 days and lose it on the paper. Either way, I get the water." Mitchie, in the kitchen doorway, didn't move, and she didn't speak. She listened the way a person listens when they don't yet know the shape of the thing they're hearing, and she stored it. Harlan glanced at her once, the way a man glances at a chair he doesn't intend to sit in, and he looked back at Denver. "I'll think on it," Denver said, because it was the only thing he could say that wasn't a surrender. Harlan rode out the way he had come. Denver stood in the yard with the note in his hand, and the paper shook, and he couldn't make it stop shaking. He had almost nothing, and what he had was 30 days from being nothing, and the woman in the doorway had heard all of it. He turned to her. He didn't know what to say, because there was nothing to say that didn't sound like an apology, and an apology would have been a kind of begging, and he hadn't begged yet and didn't intend to start. She held his gaze. Her face was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, and he understood, with a slow turn in his chest, that she had been here before too. Not this ranch, not this note, but a door closing, and a man with paper in his hand, and the moment when there's nothing left to do but stand and wait. "We have 30 days," she said. It was the first full sentence she had spoken that wasn't about food, and it wasn't a comfort. It was a count. 12 days into the 30. A buckboard came up the drive in the early dark, and the woman who climbed down from it was Harlan's wife. Her name was Ann Cawley, and she was thin, in the way that spoke of sleepless nights rather than hunger, and she came up the porch steps with the look of a woman who has run out of pride and come to the place she was told not to come. Ann didn't speak for a moment. She stood on the porch with her hands twisted in front of her, and Mitchie opened the door and waited. Denver was out at the corral, and Tucker was in town, and the 2 women stood across the threshold from each other, and didn't pretend the situation was simple. "My daughter," Ann said, "Rose. She's 8. The fever won't break, and the doctor in town has done what he can, which is nothing. They say you have needles." Mitchie looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Bring her," she said. Ann brought her that afternoon, carried in a buckboard wrapped in quilts, a small girl with hair stuck to her forehead and a breath that came too fast and too shallow. Denver watched the woman who had been ready to take his ranch carry her daughter into his kitchen and lay her on the table where the meals were served, and he didn't know where to put himself, so he went to the corral and worked the horses until the light went. Mitchie opened the lacquered box. She laid the silk roll out beside the girl, set a packet of dried herbs on the table, and lit the small lamp and turned it low. She didn't explain what she was doing, because there was no one in the room who could have understood the explanation, and she didn't promise anything, but she felt the girl's wrist with 2 fingers, looked at her tongue, and chose the needles she chose. She worked for an hour. The needles went in at points Ann couldn't see and wouldn't have understood, and Mitchie's hands didn't shake. She brewed the herbs in a pan on the stove, a small bitter brew that smelled like the earth after rain, and she spooned it into the girl's mouth a drop at a time. Ann sat in the corner and watched, and she didn't pray out loud, and she didn't look away. By midnight the girl's breath had slowed. By dawn the fever had dropped, and the child was sleeping the way a child sleeps when the crisis has passed, deep and still and heavy. Mitchie sat in the chair beside the table with her hands in her lap, and she hadn't slept, and her face had the gray look of someone who had spent the night holding a life in her hands. Ann carried Rose home at first light. She stopped at the door and turned back to Mitchie, and what passed between them wasn't thanks and not forgiveness and not friendship. It was the recognition of two women who understood what it cost to stand in a kitchen and hold a child against the worst. 3 days later, Harlan came himself. He rode up the drive alone, tied his horse to the rail, and walked inside without knocking. And he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his daughter, who was sitting at the table eating soup. The girl was thin, but the fever was gone, and the color was back in her face, and she looked up at her father and smiled. Harlan didn't look at Michi. He couldn't look at her, and his eyes went to the wall instead, and to the floor, and to the lacquered box on the shelf, and to his daughter, and to the door. He didn't say thank you, because the words wouldn't come, and he didn't say anything else, because there was nothing else that didn't cost him more than he could pay. He picked up his daughter, carried her to the horse, and rode home. Denver watched him go. He understood the way a man understands a thing he doesn't want to understand, that Harlan now owed a debt he couldn't stand, and that a man who can't stand a debt doesn't forgive the person he owes it to. The man who came 10 days later wasn't Harlan. He was a clerk out of the county seat with a badge that was half real and a paper that was half legal, and he came up the drive on a Sunday morning when the kitchen was full of cattle drivers eating breakfast. He stood in the yard and called for the woman, and he used a word Denver hadn't heard used out loud before, and the word was meant to make her small. Michi came to the door, and the clerk asked for her papers. He had no papers. The matchmaker in San Francisco had taken them, or the dead husband's family had taken them, or they had never existed in the first place. And the clerk said, in a voice loud enough for the yard to hear, that a woman without papers could be held in the county cell until someone sorted out where she belonged. The kitchen went quiet. Tucker set his cup down. The cattle driver stopped eating. Denver came out of the corral and walked across the yard. And he didn't walk fast, because walking fast would have shown the clerk he was afraid. He stopped between the clerk and the doorway, and he put his hands at his sides, and he said the 4 words that changed the shape of everything. "That's my wife," he said. The clerk looked at him, then at Mickey, then at the cattle drivers in the doorway, who had stood up, and who weren't armed, but who were also not sitting down. He wrote something in his book, asked Denver for a date and a name, wrote those down too, and wrote out the way he had come. The kitchen didn't go back to eating right away. Tucker looked at Denver, and Denver looked at Michi, and Michi looked at the floor, and then at the shelf where the lacquered box sat, and then at Denver. The 4 words had been spoken to save her, and now the 4 words had to be true, or the next clerk with a badge would tear the wall down. They married the next evening. There was no preacher within a day's ride who would marry a rancher to a Japanese woman in the territory, so they didn't use one. Tucker stood up as the witness, and Denver wrote the date and the names in the ranch book, the big ledger that held the count of cattle and the count of hay, and now the count of a marriage, and Michi signed her name beneath his in-brush strokes that the ledger had never seen. He gave her his mother's ring. It was a thin gold band that had been his mother's and his grandmother's before that, and it was too big for her finger, and she wore it on a cord around her neck, where the kimono covered it, because a ring on a cord is a private thing, and a ring on a finger is a story a clerk can read. It wasn't love, and it wasn't yet trust, but it was a recognition. 2 people who had both learned what it meant to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves had agreed to stand together, and the agreement had been made not with a vow, but with a lie that had to become true. That night, for the first time, she slept in the front room instead of the back, and he slept on the cot by the kitchen, and neither of them said anything about it, because saying something would have made it a different kind of story than the one they were building. The 30 days ran out on a Tuesday. Harlan came up the drive at noon with 4 men behind him and a rewritten deed in his coat, and the deed said the south pasture and the creek and the ranch house and the kitchen where the meals were served now belonged to the man who had bought the paper. He came at noon because noon was when the kitchen was full, and he meant to take the place in front of the people who had been eating there, so they would know who owned the water before they rode home. Denver was on the porch. He had the ranch book in his hand, and he had a revolver on his hip, and he had no intention of using either one. He had decided, somewhere in the 30 days, that he wasn't going to shoot his way out of a debt, and he wasn't going to sign the place over either, but was going to stand on the porch and see what the day brought. Harlan stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He didn't dismount. He held out the deed. "The note's due," he said. "You can sign, or I can take it." "I'll do neither," Denver said, and his voice was steady because he had practiced neither in his head for a week. The 4 men behind Harlan weren't armed with anything but their presence, and their presence was the kind of weight that had taken 4 ranches before this one. The kitchen had gone quiet, with Tucker in the doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder, the store owner at the table with his wife, and a half-dozen men and women who had ridden out for a meal sitting beside them, and none of them moving. Then Ann Cawley walked out of the kitchen. She had ridden over with the store owner's wife that morning, and she had eaten at the table, and she hadn't said a word to anyone about why she was there. She came out onto the porch with her hands empty and her face set, and she stopped beside Denver and faced her husband on the horse. "Go home, Harlan," she said. Harlan looked at her, and at Denver, and at the people in the doorway who had stood up, and at the people at the table who had stood up, and at his own wife who had stood up against him. He had come to take a ranch in front of the people who ate there, and instead the people who ate there had stood up, and the woman who had reason to stand with him had stood against him. Michi came to the doorway. She didn't push past anyone, and she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't come out onto the porch. She stood in the door of the kitchen with a cloth in her hands, and she looked at Harlan the way she had looked at the plate the first night, and at the lacquered box, and at the needles, and at Rose the way a person looks at someone who is welcome to come in and eat or welcome to ride home, but who isn't welcome to take the kitchen. "You sit, you eat," she said. "You go home." The English was a few words she had, and the voice was the voice of a woman who had crossed an ocean and been thrown out on the road and had cooked her way back into a kitchen that was now hers, and the voice carried the whole weight of that. Harlan sat on the horse for a long moment. The 4 men behind him scanned the porch, the door, and each other, and not one of them reached for anything. Harlan rode home. The 4 men rode home behind him. The deed stayed in his coat, and the note stayed in the county book, and the water stayed where it had always been. That evening, Denver and Harlan's man rode out and came back with a new paper, written by the store owner and signed by both of them, and the paper said the debt would be paid in meals and medicine over the next year, and the water would be shared, and the south pasture would stay with the ranch. It wasn't a victory in the way victories are usually counted. It was a kitchen that had become too useful to lose, and a woman too necessary to displace, and a town that had decided where it stood. A year later, the ranch was alive. The creek ran, the south pasture held cattle, and the kitchen fed the territory 3 meals a day. Michi had taught Tucker and 2 new hands to cook the things she cooked, and Denver had learned to read the recipe paper slowly with her hand on his when he couldn't find the shape of a brush stroke. The lacquered box sat open on the shelf above the stove, the way it had since the first week. The needles lay in their silk roll beside the flour, and the herbs beside the salt, and the recipe paper was weighted with a smooth stone from the creek, and the carved spoon hung on a nail where she could reach it without looking. What had been carried across an ocean had finally found a kitchen that wanted it, and the kitchen had become the room the whole ranch turned around. One evening when the hands had gone and the lamp was low, she sat across from him and asked him why he had fed her that first night, when he had almost nothing, when a plate of food was the finest thing he owned. He thought about it for a long time before he answered, because he hadn't thought about it in words. He told her about the line shack in the snow, and the stranger who had fed him without asking why, and the promise he had made to himself on the empty stomach of a hungry young man, and he told her the promise had been the kind a man makes and forgets, until the night she knocked, and then he had remembered it in his hands before he remembered it in his head. She listened, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and then she nodded once, the way she had nodded when he told her his name, storing something somewhere safe. "I didn't ask for scraps because I wanted scraps," she said. "I asked for scraps because it was the only question I had left that a stranger might say yes to." The lamp burned low. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the creek ran the way it had always run, and the road that had brought her to his door went on east toward the country she had come from, and neither of them looked at it. The lacquered box sits open on the shelf, needles beside the flour, recipe paper weighted with a creek stone. What was carried across an ocean had found a kitchen that wanted it. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and if it moved you, hit that like button. Whether the scraps were a test or the last honest thing she had left, the kitchen never answered.